Boldwood presents Second Chances at Cherry Tree Cottage, written by Jo Bartlett and read by Emma Powell. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Prologue. Opening the door of the fridge, I pulled out the carton of eggs. It was empty. I could tell before I even flipped it open. There were 8 people already seated in the dining room, eagerly anticipating the full English breakfast we promised on our website, and we were out of eggs. Again. Luke, where did you put the eggs you said you got yesterday? Only it doesn't look like they're in the fridge. I looked across at my husband, who was staring at his phone and barely seemed to register that I'd spoken to him. Luke, the eggs, where are they? My voice was rising, and I didn't want another row. But if he'd forgotten to get the most basic of supplies again, I wasn't sure I was going to be able to stop myself. Oh, Christ, I forgot. Sorry. He finally looked up at me and gave the smallest of shrugs. If there'd been any eggs left in the carton, he'd have been wearing them by now. You forgot. Sometimes I wonder if you're doing this on purpose, sabotaging the business so that... I couldn't finish the sentence. So that what? I don't know. I just can't believe you can forget stuff this important. It's only some eggs. Geez, Scarlett, you're so uptight. I've been under a lot of pressure. And I haven't. My voice was rising again, and Ava looked up from the colouring book that had been keeping her occupied. She was only 3 years old, and she'd already got used to sitting in a corner, keeping quiet and colouring in, whilst her dad and I tried desperately to keep our bed and breakfast business afloat. At least one of us was trying desperately. All right, we both have. Luke's tone softened as he walked over to me, putting his hands on my shoulders. I'll nip out now and get some. I'll be 5 minutes at most. Just ply that lot with an extra round of tea and toast and they'll never even notice the delay. What about Ava? I thought you were going to keep an eye on her whilst I did the cooking. She's a good girl, aren't you, sweetheart? Luke looked across at her, and Ava gave him a serious nod. Anyway, Maureen will be in soon, won't she? So it'll be all hands on deck, and you can get on with the breakfasts in peace. I suppose so. Just be as quick as you can, okay? I turned towards him again, and he planted a kiss on my lips. Most of the anger and resentment I felt melting away the moment he did. Luke had always had that effect on me. Trouble was, he knew it as well as I did. I'll be back before you know it. Scout's honour. With that, he was gone, slamming the kitchen door behind him, as I pulled out an uncut loaf from the bread bin and set about making another round of toast. Cooey! 10 minutes later, just when I was on the edge of hyperventilating, the back door from the yard to the kitchen flew open. Maureen, who came in 4 mornings a week to help with the cleaning and room changeovers, gave me a cheerful wave. Sorry I'm a couple of minutes late, Scarlett, but that hubby of yours rang me and said you needed me to pick up some eggs on the way over. I was only a few doors down by that point, so I had to walk back to Boscawen's on the corner. Thankfully, they still had some of the free-range eggs left from yesterday's delivery. Thanks, Maureen. I forced a smile. Where the hell was Luke? You okay, my love? You look a bit stressed. Maureen's lilting accent was almost too much. I wanted to burst into tears and tell her I definitely wasn't okay, but I bit my lip instead. I'm fine. It's just that Luke said he was getting the eggs. I forced another smile. Still, it doesn't matter. At least I've got them now. There are only so many rounds of toast I can give the guests before they start to get suspicious. He said something had come up, but that he'd be back as soon as possible. You know, Luke, there'll be something to explain it all when he gets back. She smiled and I nodded my head. That was the thing with my husband. He always had a plausible explanation. I'll get on with the breakfast then, Maureen. Thanks. Could I be really cheeky and ask if you'd help Ava get ready for nursery? Luke was supposed to be doing it and then taking her in for 10 o'clock, but it looks like I'll need to do that when I'm finished up here. I know it's not part of your job, but if you could just get her dressed and ready, I'll really owe you one. It'll be my pleasure, my love. Me and Ava always have so much fun, don't we, darling? Yes, Nanny Maureen. Ava took her hand and I felt another pang of guilt. That someone I paid a wage to for cleaning the B&B had become a stand-in grandmother for my daughter. when I barely got the chance to be a proper mother to her lately. Something was going to have to change, and I was determined to speak to Luke about it as soon as he got back. It had gone on for long enough. It wasn't a surprise when Luke wasn't back in time to take Ava to nursery, but that didn't make it any less infuriating. I barely had time to stack the dishwasher after breakfast before heading out the door with Ava to go to the nursery 3 roads away. She was skipping along, singing a song about a frog on a log all the way there. Poor little thing probably couldn't wait to get to nursery, where she gets some one-to-one attention for a change. "See you later, darling." I knelt down to kiss her cheek as one of the nursery assistants took her backpack and coat. "Bye, Mummy." She threw her little arms around my neck, and I felt another pang. She never held how distracted I was against me, but somehow that just made the guilt worse. "Have lots of fun with your friends today." "I will, Mummy. Are you picking me up, or is Daddy?" Suddenly her little face clouded over. Luke had missed more than one pick-up slot, resulting in frantic calls from the nursery and a £1 fine for every minute we were late past their closing time. Worse than that was the look on Ava's face when I finally got there. She never said anything, but she didn't need to. "I'll be here, darling, I promise." "Love you, Mummy." With the smile firmly back on her face and with one last wave, she disappeared into a group of other preschoolers. Worries she shouldn't have had, about whether her daddy would remember to pick her up from nursery or not, were forgotten for now. Heading home towards the B&B, I thought about what I was going to say to Luke when he got back. It wouldn't be an easy conversation, but I needed to have it for Ava's sake. I wanted the B&B to work, but I wanted my marriage to work more. Most of all, I wanted Ava to have the childhood she deserved. I stopped to pick up some more eggs from Boscowan's on the way, as I knew they had a delivery from one of the local farms at 10 every morning. At least that was one less thing to worry about. Taking my mobile out of my pocket, I checked my messages. There was still no reply from Luke about where he was, or what time I could expect him home. Then I saw him. He was getting into the passenger side of a bright red sports car with the sort of throaty exhaust that vibrated through your whole body when it drove past. Breaking into a run, I called out his name and waved my free hand in the air, clutching the carton of eggs in the other. He must have seen me. The front windscreen was facing in my direction, but the sun was shining on it, so I couldn't see who was driving. I wanted to speak to my husband now, though, and I wasn't going to wait. Stepping out into the road as the car pulled forward seemed like the only option. Except it didn't work. The car revved hard and shot down the road, so close to me that I fell backwards, landing on the carton of eggs as I did. "Oh, God, are you okay?" A woman about my age, who'd been walking along the pavement opposite, dropped her shopping bags and rushed into the road to help me up. "I'm not hurt. I've just broken my eggs." It was then that I started to cry, as I looked back at the mess of broken shells and raw eggs running along the middle of the road in the direction of the B&B. "Did you get the number plate?" The woman patted my back gently as she led me out of the road and onto the safety of the pavement. "No, it was all so quick." "Well, I'll keep an eye out for them and note the plate down if I see them again. If you report it to the police, I can let them know." She looked outraged on my behalf, but I just shook my head. "It's okay. I'm okay. I don't want to make any fuss, and there's nothing the police could do." "If you're sure, I suppose you're right anyway. They were almost certainly tourists driving like that round here," she tutted. "It's probably the last we'll see of them." I nodded, but I had no way of knowing at the time how right she was, and that it would turn out to be the last I saw of my husband for quite some time. Chapter 1. "I've made you a packed lunch." Mum pushed the lunchbox across the kitchen island. It had a picture of the boy band Blue on the front, the same one I'd had when I started secondary school. I suppose I should have been grateful that it wasn't the Care Bears one I'd taken as a 6-year-old to Applebury Primary School, where I was now about to start work. Although it wouldn't have surprised me if she'd kept that too. "Thanks, Mum." I opened it up. 2 Scotch eggs, a tube of petit filou, and an apple were wedged up against a carton of orange juice. It really was the 90s all over again. All I needed to complete it was a cheese string. I don't want you getting into the habit of eating a school dinner every day. It's all too easy to pack on the pounds. She swore by a low-carb diet, and even the Scotch eggs were made with high-fibre coconut flour. I was lucky I had an apple instead of a couple of chicken drumsticks. She'd offered me those for breakfast instead. Have you made a lunch for Ava? No, I thought you should be the one to do that, what with it being her first day at school and everything. Mum squeezed my hand and we exchanged a look. Just occasionally she knew when to step back. Thanks again, Mum, for everything. I moved over to the fridge and grabbed what I needed to make Ava's lunch. Turning back to face the kitchen window, I could see Ava skipping around the garden with my dad. It had been the right decision to come home, even if it had been my only choice at the time. You excited about starting your new job today? Mum hovered behind me as I made Ava a sandwich. I was half expecting her to give me the usual speech about how all carbs were poison, so talking about my new job was a welcome surprise. I am, but you know what it's like. Starting something new is always a bit scary. We've loved having you and Ava home, but I'm hoping today will help you kickstart the next stage of your life. You don't want to end up like Auntie Layla. Mum, please. She must have said that sentence at least 3 times a day in the 6 months I've been back in Applebury. There should have been a plaque with it engraved on, under the ones that read, "Home is where the heart is and family comes first," which hung on the kitchen wall under the shelf of cookbooks. Oh, I know, I'm not supposed to mention you finding someone new, but it's been over a year, Scarlett, and that man isn't worth wasting another second on. I'm not wasting anything on him, Mum. Ava and I are getting on with our lives, but if I end up like Auntie Layla, that's okay with me. She's happy, she does a job she loves, and she's always out and about with friends. Sounds pretty good to me. Yes, but then she goes home to her cottage and she's on her own, except when she's fostering one of those dogs. That was the reason she didn't come for Easter. Do you know that? She tutted, but I suspected Layla's dog-sitting wasn't the only reason she'd avoided Easter at Mum and Dad's. A no-carb roast dinner was no one's idea of fun. And I'm convinced that's why she overeats too. Deep down, she's lonely, however much she bangs on about not being the marrying sort, and I don't want you to end up like that. Mum, I couldn't even find the words to reply. I didn't have the headspace, and she'd never understand anyway. Auntie Layla wanted different things to her. She always had. And so did I from now on. Relationships were overrated. All right, I won't mention it again. We both knew she was lying. I'll have to head off in a minute. Are you going to wish me luck? Nerves fluttered in my stomach, and thinking about the Scotch eggs again as I picked up the lunch as a wave of nausea swept over me. I don't need to wish you luck. You'll do brilliantly. You've always been a success at everything you've done. Not everything. I squeezed my eyes shut. It was always going to be an emotional day, dropping my little girl off for her first day at school. But her dad should have been there to see it too, and I'd failed at that. I'd failed her. None of that was your fault. Mum hugged me, and it was a bit like cuddling an ironing board. There wasn't an ounce of fat she'd allowed to make itself at home. But I was so grateful that she and Dad had always been there for me. I had to do the same for Ava now, and nothing was ever going to get in the way of that again. It was a beautiful day, and for once I didn't mind that I'd had to sell the car, along with everything else that wasn't bolted down before I'd moved home. The early autumn sun was warm on my back as we made the short walk up to Applebury Primary. The school was on the side of a narrow country lane, opposite the 16th century church which clung to the hillside like a mountain goat. Dad said it had been built there so the worshippers would be closer to God, but it had always looked to me like it had been carved out of the hillside itself. Beyond the village were miles of open farmland, hop gardens, some trendy new vineyards that had started to gain favour in this part of Kent to make the most of the climate, and the hundreds of orchards which lent Applebury its name. Rumour had it that Henry VIII himself had christened the county the Garden of England after tasting a bowl of the undeniably delicious local cherries. I'd always thought that when I grew up, I'd buy one of the cottages dotted around the village and have my own cherry and apple trees in the garden. But then I'd met Luke. "Mummy, is it true that you have to keep your finger on your lips all day at school?" Ava looked up at me, jolting me back to the present, her blue eyes round with concern. The nerves were obviously starting to get to her, too. "Who told you that?" "Archie." "Well, it's not true, darling." Archie Green had been at nursery with Ava 2 villages away. There hadn't been a space for her at the nursery in Applebury when we'd come home, and I'd been worried that it might make the transition to primary school more difficult. But I was glad she'd be getting away from Archie. He'd also told her that eating fruit could give you head lice and that monsters waited behind your curtains at night until your parents turned out the light and then came out to scare you. Sometimes children who don't know how to listen are asked to put their fingers on their lips for a few minutes to remind them not to talk whilst the teacher is talking. "I'm good at listening, aren't I, Mummy?" "Yes, darling." My eyes were burning again. She was such a good girl, and from the moment I'd set eyes on her, she'd always seemed perfect to me. If I lived to be 110, I'd never understand how anyone could walk out of her life without a backward glance. "I can't wait to play in the sandpit like before." Ava was skipping again, the worries Archie had planted easily forgotten. She'd had a couple of taster sessions at the school in July after I'd been offered the job as the Year 1 and 2 teacher. It was such a small school that only the reception year had a class of its own. The other 3 classes were made up of 2 year groups combined. It would give me some challenges as a teacher, but I was looking forward to getting back into the classroom on a permanent basis. I'd done a bit of supply work in the 6 months we'd been home, but this would give us both some stability. "I'm sure you're going to love lots of things about school. I'll take you into your classroom, darling, but then I've got to go and see the children in my class and their mums and their parents." I stopped myself on the word dads. It was stupid. It was hardly as if I could protect her from every mention of the word for the rest of her life, or even the rest of the day. But I hated reminding her of what she didn't have. "Okay, Mummy. I like being with Mr. Ellis anyway. He's nice." As we rounded the final bend in the road, the school came into view ahead of us, and there were other parents already waiting to drop off their children. The reception class had been asked to come in half an hour early to avoid overwhelming the children on their first day with the usual chaos of drop-off. There was one dad clutching the hand of a tearful-looking little boy, with what I assumed was his mother on the other side. But the rest of the children were just with their mums, so I needn't have spent half the night before worrying that Ava would feel singled out. It was one of the downsides to a tiny village school with less than 70 kids, where at first glance everyone seemed to have a Range Rover and a traditional family setup. I could claim ownership of a 15-year-old mountain bike, languishing in Mum and Dad's shed, and a husband who'd apparently fallen off the face of the earth. I wasn't exactly flying under the radar. An experience had taught me most children just wanted to fit in. "Good morning, Mr. Ellis." I smiled at Ava's teacher, who was also my new boss, as we went into his classroom. Applebury had been federated with another small primary school in a neighbouring village a few years before, so the head teacher split her time between the 2 schools. Cameron Ellis was the assistant head of Applebury and had day-to-day responsibility for the school as a result. He'd been on my interview panel and had observed me teaching the Year 1 and 2 pupils before they'd offered me the job. "Good morning, Mrs. West." I'd agonised over whether to start the new job using my maiden name, but that might have thrown up more questions for Ava, and I wanted us to have the same name. Maybe I was more like my mother than I wanted to admit. Cameron bent down to draw level with Ava. "I'm really pleased you'll be joining my class. Do you want to sit next to Daisy?" Ava nodded, and I planted a quick kiss on the top of her head as she walked towards a table covered with paper and colouring pencils. I was determined not to cry. "Are you okay?" Cameron touched my elbow and I swallowed hard, nodding my head. "It's just a big day for both of us." "I think you're doing great." The children are usually fine and we only ever get a few tears from them. But sometimes I actually have to ask the parents to leave because they're upsetting the kids." Cameron laughed and I couldn't help smiling. He was right. All of this bothered me far more than Ava. "Good luck with your first day, and you know where I am if you need me." "Thank you. And you'll let me know if there are any issues with Ava?" "Of course." I crossed the corridor towards my classroom. It was an old building with heavy flagstones on the corridor floor, and the walls on either side were lined with the children's artwork and tiles decorated by Year 6 students moving on to secondary school. My teaching assistant, Ruhan, was already in the classroom, and she smiled when she looked up and saw me. We'd been introduced after I was offered the job, and I discovered that she'd been a TA at the school for over 10 years, so at least I had someone to lean on until I found my feet again. "Morning. Are you excited about your first day?" Ruhan carried on setting out laminated labels with the children's names on as we spoke. "Excited, terrified, nauseous. It'll fly by, and by the time you've been here for a week, you'll feel as if you've worked here forever." Ruhan smiled again, and I set my bags down by the desk at the front of the classroom. It suddenly felt very real, but I'd always found the best way to deal with fear was to tackle things head-on, at least until recently. Within half an hour, we had the classroom set up how I wanted it, and we were talking through my lesson plans for the first day. There were a couple of children who Ruhan would support more closely, but with a total of 20 children in the class, including 2 new starters, I'd be monitoring her input over the first couple of weeks to see if we needed to make any adjustments. Ruhan had explained there were also some parents and grandparents who came in to do reading with the children, so I'd be assessing the children who would benefit from that the most. If the first 30 minutes were anything to go by, Ruhan was right. Time really was going to fly. "It's show time." She grinned over her shoulder and unlocked the door at the far end of the classroom, which led out onto the playground. As soon as she pulled it back, a line of parents and their children started to file in. I could see Natasha Chisholm out of the corner of my eye, chatting to Ruhan, and another wave of nausea surged in my stomach. But I pushed it down, getting on with the business of speaking to the parents who hadn't just dropped their children and bolted. "Scarlett, it's lovely to see you." Natasha seized her chance the moment Henry Baxter's dad walked away after he'd filled me in on the triggers for his asthma. She threw her arms out, and for one horrible moment I thought she was going to hug me. "I couldn't believe it when I found out you were going to be Ode's teacher. I was so sorry to hear about what happened between you and Luke, and I just wish James had been able to tell you something that might have helped. It must be just tragic for little Ava." She's taken it all in her stride. I forced such a tight smile onto my face that my lip felt like it might actually split. A few of the other parents were openly staring at us, and somehow I resisted the urge to tell Natasha to mind her own bloody business. I should have known it was coming. She'd been at school with Luke and had ended up marrying his best friend, James. They'd all been 5 years above me, so I hadn't really known any of them at the time. But James was the best man at our wedding, and I got in contact with him the week after Luke walked out. Despite Natasha's see-through sympathy, I was sure they knew more than they were saying. "Oh, I don't know how I'd cope if James left me. You and Ava are both being so brave." And she was being so patronising. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe coming back to Applebury hadn't been such a great idea after all. There was a good chance the parents in my class would all know the intimate details of my personal life before afternoon pickup. I might as well have got some flyers printed and put them in the kids' book bags. "Is there anything you'd like me to know about Ode?" Other than the fact that she's got a ridiculous name. My internal monologue was working overtime, but I couldn't say any of the things to Natasha that I wanted. Getting back at her wouldn't change the fact that Luke had left, and it might even lose me my job. He was the one I should be focusing all my anger on anyway. "According to Cam, she's an absolute dream to teach because she picks things up so quickly, and I'm sure you'll find the same." Natasha smiled, and I was silently praying she'd have a bit of lipstick on her teeth, but she was far too perfect for that. I suppose I should say Mr. Ellis when the children are around, but when you're a linchpin of the PTA, you develop a much closer relationship with the staff. Are you the chair, then? It was a perfect, if slightly pathetic, opportunity to get a tiny bit of revenge. I'd heard all about the power struggle in the PTA via one of Mum's friends, and how desperate Natasha apparently was to step into the role of chair. Just a matter of time. Natasha tapped her nose. And I hope you'll be joining us. Mr. Ellis, comes to all the meetings. And that's why the size of the PTA has more than doubled since he started. He's a classic, tall, dark and handsome, and it's definitely worth volunteering to run the tombola for a chance to stare into those eyes. A woman in what looked like a hand-knitted jumper, which stretched down to just above the top of her Wellington boots, laughed loudly at her own joke, earning her a dismissive look from Natasha. The first meeting of this term is on Friday after school, so I'll look forward to catching up with you properly then. Natasha raised an eyebrow, and I found myself nodding, despite the fact that there was almost nothing I wanted less than to give her another chance to tell the world what a total balls-up I'd made of holding on to my husband. Chapter 2. On the Thursday of my first week at school, Mum picked Ava up to take her to see the latest Disney movie, and I was using the opportunity to get some marking done in the quiet of an empty classroom. If I took her home, Dad would want to chat about my day or invite me out to the garden to see if I thought his giant squash had got any bigger. He'd entered it into the church's annual Harvest Festival contest, and Mum frequently complained that he spent more time with it than her. It wasn't that I didn't like spending time with Dad, or even pretending to be interested in weighing up the pros and cons of natural and synthetic fertilizer. All I knew for sure was which one smelt worse. But I was trying my best to keep my home and work life separate, to give Ava some quality time. And the chance to get some of my marking out of the way was too good an opportunity to miss. I'm not interrupting anything, am I? Cameron knocked on the frame of the open classroom door, and I shook my head. I wasn't about to tell my new boss I was too busy to speak to him, even if I was. I was just doing some marking. Do you want to sit down? I smiled and gestured to one of the kids' chairs. It was bright red and about half the size of the one I was sitting on. But Cameron sat on one of the tables instead, and I grabbed my chance. How's Ava doing? Really well. She's always trying to help the other kids out, and she seems to be interested in every topic we tackle. I could do with a whole classroom of Avas. That's good to hear. My shoulders relaxed. It didn't matter what else Cameron wanted to talk about as long as Ava was happy. So did you want to speak to me about something in particular? I was wondering if you'd be willing to do a joint performance with the reception class for Harvest Festival. If every class does their own thing, the service can end up being painfully long, and I mean painfully. It also means not every child gets a chance to have a speaking role if they want one. He shook his head. You wouldn't believe the fallout that causes with some of the parents. Oh, I would. I've already been asked by at least 3 of the mums whether their child is doing a reading at the service. I hadn't realised it was such a big deal. It is to some of them, and it's actually caused some nasty arguments in the playground in the past. The parents are far worse than the kids. So I've decided to take the easy way out this year and give everyone the same opportunity. Coward. I laughed and instantly regretted it, hoping I hadn't misread Cameron's sense of humour and pushed it too far with a new boss I barely knew. You wouldn't say that if you'd ever been pinned into the corner of your classroom by Claire Winters for not giving her son a big enough role in the nativity play. I actually thought it was going to get physical at one point. It was his turn to laugh. I think it'd be fun for the kids to do something together. I know Ava loves it when the older girls let her join in with them at playtime. I wrinkled my nose. Sorry, I know we're supposed to be gender neutral and all that, but she just gravitates towards the girls. Probably means I'm a massive failure as a modern mother. From what I've seen, you seem to be doing everything right. Thanks. I looked down at the colourful stickman drawing in front of me, hoping Cameron was right. Have you got anything in mind for Harvest Festival, then? I was hoping you might have a folder full of ideas you were just dying to share. Sorry, no folder. But I was thinking of doing something to celebrate Harvest Festival around the world, like the Festival of Yams in some African countries and Oktoberfest in Germany. We should be able to find enough places to give all the kids a couple of lines each, and if there are some who don't want to speak, they can hold up the pictures instead. That sounds perfect. I knew I could rely on you. Cameron smiled, and I tried not to blush like a 12-year-old. We could get really ambitious and make some of the fruit and veg out of papier-mâché. I think that'll be right up Ruhan's street. The kids would love that. Cameron stood up. I'll email you so we can set aside some time next week to plan it properly. You're doing a great job so far, by the way. I knew I was onto a winner when I suggested papier-mâché yams. There's a lot more to you than papier-mâché yams. His words forced me to look down at the stick man again. It was proving hard to take a compliment after so long without one. But the question is whether you're ready to pass the real initiation test and go to the PTA meeting tomorrow night. I didn't think I had a choice, at least not the way Natasha Chisholm explained it to me. I shrugged, passing her off as just another pushy parent. There was no need for him to know we had a shared history of sorts. I wanted to keep my private life private, if Natasha would let me. I'd just have to keep my fingers crossed that opening her big mouth once would be enough. So you've had the royal command, then? Cameron laughed. Natasha's reputation doing all the work for me. It was something like that. But as a teacher and a parent, I really should join the PTA, shouldn't I? Absolutely. And it will be nice to have another teacher there to help me manage some of the parents' expectations. I'll see you there then, if I don't catch up with you during the day tomorrow. I didn't want to admit that a Friday night PTA meeting was the only thing in my diary for the whole weekend. It was probably time to make some new friends, and the PTA meeting was as good a place to start as any. The meeting was being held upstairs in a private room at one of the 2 pubs in Applebury. The Gamekeeper's Arms was an old-fashioned country pub with low lighting, a wide selection of real ales, and ancient dusty hop vines hanging from the beams in the main bar. Ruhan had told me the meetings were held there during the evening so that some of the working mums could go, and to make it more of a social occasion. It made me feel slightly less of a loser to know I wasn't the only one whose social highlight was a PTA meeting. Hesitating outside the door of the pub, it was like I was about to go on a blind date rather than meet up with other parents from the school. So it was a relief to see Ruhan already waiting when I finally pushed the door open. Let me get you a drink, I offered, joining her at the bar. You don't need to do that, I'll get you one. Her ready smile rarely left her face, even when the kids were doing their best to test her patience. I'd overheard her telling one of the children that her name meant kind-hearted in Hindi, and her parents had definitely made the right choice. No, it's the least I can do. I can't tell you how much help you've been this first week. I've got to be honest, I was a bit apprehensive about working with a new teacher after working with Lizzie for so many years. But it's been like a breath of fresh air, and Cam can't stop talking about you. She dropped me a wink and I laughed. Despite my intentions, I'd found myself sharing the details of my marriage breakdown with Ruhan. But I didn't have much choice after Natasha had more or less announced it on our first day of working together. Ruhan was clearly cut from the same cloth as Mum, though, and she'd decided that the only single man who worked at the school would be an ideal match for me. Poor Cameron, he'd probably be as horrified as I was if he found out. But protesting too much just seemed to add fuel to the fire. The best thing to do was ignore comments you didn't like. That was what I always told the kids in my class. So what can I get you then? Just a lime and soda, please, Ruhan said. And I just hoped she wouldn't judge the vodka and tonic I'd ordered. I needed it if I was going to face Natasha again. Drink in hand, I followed Ruhan across the bar and upstairs to the private function room. It was clad with dark wood panelling, and a mismatched selection of tables and chairs had already been organised into a U-shape. Evening, Ruhan. A plump woman with unruly salt and pepper curls came over from behind the top row of tables and held out her hand to me. And you must be the new teacher I've heard such good things about. I'm Dolly Swan, chair of the PTA. She had the hint of an Australian accent and a relaxed demeanour that immediately put me at ease. Lovely to meet you. I'm Scarlett West. I teach years 1 and 2, and I've got a daughter, Ava, in reception. Double bubble, then. Dolly had deep lines around her eyes, which made her look as if she spent most of her life laughing. I really miss having little ones in reception. My youngest, Billy, has just started year 6, and I'm already dreading the day he leaves, and I've got no excuse to attend the nativity play anymore. I'm just hoping my eldest, who's 26, won't wait too long before she makes me a grandma. I'd have had another one when Billy started in reception if this old bugger of a body hadn't let me down. You won't be saying that when you have to carry your bladder around in a Tesco's carrier bag because having so many kids has ruined your bits and pieces like my poor old mum, Molly Dawkins' mother said as she came towards us. I recognised her from when she dropped Molly off in my class on the first day of term. She'd been the one wearing a hand-knitted jumper that reached down past her knees. So you're telling me your mum carries a bladder around in a carrier bag? Dolly was still grinning, and this was already turning out to be a lot more fun than I'd thought. All right then, not exactly. But she had 6 kids, and they had to prop her up in a hammock just so she didn't have to buy shares in Tenor Lady. You should be grateful you stopped at 5 for one more, and who knows? She held out her hand to me. Kate Dawkins, my daughter Molly is in your class, and she told me last night that she prefers you to me. Oh dear, I'm sorry about that. I didn't know what to say, but Kate just laughed. Don't be. It's a step up from her preferring the dog and the Domino's delivery driver, both of whom I've been compared to unfavourably in the last week. God help me when that girl turns 13. If it's any consolation, she's an absolute pleasure to have in the class. Well, that's something. I don't need Natasha Chisholm and her gang to have any more ammunition. I'm already a shoo-in for the Bad Mum of the Year award. I've tried teaching Molly and Barnaby that the organic farmers market is code for McDonald's, but the little sods are always dropping me in it. I don't know why you worry so much what they think. Dolly looked up as she moved around the tables, putting a set of papers in front of each chair. That's easy for you to say because you know you're nearly out of here. 9 more months and you're home free. I've got to have her looking down her nose at me for another 5 years. I can't wait until Molly's in year 5 like Barnaby, and I can let her jump out of the car by the school gates and take herself into the playground. But even that's 4 years away. She's not that bad when you get to know her. Ruhan's tone was reasonable, but Kate was having none of it. She's not bad, she's worse. Kate crossed her arms. I decided I didn't like her when I first saw her, and she's done nothing to change my mind since. Oh, but don't feel bad for her. The feeling is entirely mutual. I went to school with her, but she was 5 years above me. There was much more I could have said, but there was no way I'd badmouth a parent in public. Oh, I bet she hates that, you being 5 years younger than her. That's why she had to get that snide comment in about your ex-husband doing a runner. Kate gave me a sympathetic look. Did she really say that? Dolly's face dropped, but sympathy was the last thing I wanted. She blabbed on about what a tragedy it was or something. But then I heard her filling her cronies in on the details out by the school gate. Kate narrowed her eyes. See, I've always said she was bitchy. So everyone knows what happened with Luke. My voice sounded small, even to me. But I'd had enough of Luke making me feel small. If this was going to be out in the open, it was going to be on my terms and with all the facts, not just Natasha's version. They know I left you high and dry, but don't worry, no one else is gossiping about it. They're just sorry for you, that's all. Kate cocked her head to one side. I'd been about to tell her that sympathy was my kryptonite when Natasha Chisholm threw open the door of the function room. She was carrying a bottle of Prosecco and an ice bucket, and 3 other women followed her in, all sitting together on one side of the arrangement of tables. They had expensive-looking haircuts and had clearly mastered the art of contouring, which had left me looking like a road map of Spaghetti Junction the one and only time I'd tried it. The way they looked everyone else up and down made it hard not to take a leaf out of Kate's book and decide to dislike them on sight. Where's Cam? Natasha directed the question at Dolly as her friends giggled about something that was on one of their phones and casted glances on Kate. It was like going back to secondary school, and it seemed not much had changed if you didn't wear the right clothes or fit in with the in-crowd. I didn't want to think back at the times I'd done that to someone at school, but once or twice I'd been guilty of being as much of a cow as Natasha's friends were being right now, except I'd been all of 13 at the time. He said he might be a bit late. He had to go and fix a leak at his mum's place, but he'll be here as soon as he can." Dolly took a seat in the centre of the table, and Ruhan and I sat opposite the yummy mummies, while Kate sat next to Dolly. Katrina Polinsky and Laura Brown have both sent their apologies along with Miss Wallace and Mrs. Salter from Class 3 and 4, so it's only Cameron we're waiting for. Seeing as he's already said he'll be late, I think we should make a start. So neither of the junior school teachers or Mrs. Davy could be bothered to put in an appearance then. Natasha actually made a note in the jotter in front of her, and I couldn't help wondering if my name was already in there too. They've both got things going on at home which mean they can't be here tonight, and Mrs. Davy's on a weekend training course in Milton Keynes, so she's travelling up there this evening. Dolly's perfectly reasonable explanation did little to appease Natasha. Funny how she never misses a PTA meeting at Oak Tree Forestall. Ruhan had already warned me about the tensions with the other school in the Federation. A lot of the parents resented the fact that Nancy Davy seemed to spend more of her time at the bigger of the two primary schools she oversaw. My guess was it had more to do with the fact that Cameron was a really capable assistant head, rather than any favouritism. But clearly not everyone felt that way. Let's press on then, and you can raise any concerns you've got with Cameron when he arrives. Let's leave that until the end of the agenda, though, so we don't get sidetracked by the same old discussions. Dolly was a surprisingly authoritative chairperson, which made her more than capable of dealing with the women on Natasha's side of the table, despite their best efforts to take over. They'd apparently all been elected class reps at the end of the term before, so they had a big say in how any funds raised by the PTA ended up being spent. Claire Winters was rep for reception, Danny Bennett for years 3 and 4, and Tanya Slater for years 5 and 6. Typical of my luck, Natasha was class rep for years 2 and 3, so I'd have to put any requests for PTA funds to her, and worse than that, we'd have to meet once a month. My instant reaction was to consider asking Janie Salter if I could swap with her and teach years 5 and 6 for the rest of the school year, despite the neurosis of parents whose children were prepping for grammar school entrance tests. The prospect of meeting up with Natasha Chisholm on a regular basis was that bad. Agenda item 3 is the autumn fundraiser. It was 45 minutes into the meeting, and as Dolly started to outline the next item, Cameron finally arrived. Along with Ruhan, I'd been trying to contribute from the school's point of view, but I was relieved to see him. After only a week in the job, half the time I wasn't even 100% sure if what I was saying was true. "I'm really sorry, things at Mum's were worse than I thought." Cameron held up his hand in my direction, and I couldn't help but wonder if I looked the way I felt, like a rabbit caught in the headlights. "No problem. I hope everything's okay now." Dolly turned to Cameron, who nodded. "We were just about to start on the autumn fundraiser." "Great." Cameron took a seat as he spoke. "Well, I know from Mrs. Davy that Oak Tree Forestall are planning a copper snake in the playground." "And I heard they're planning to break the county record." I had no idea what they were talking about, but whatever it was had caused Natasha's voice to raise at least an octave. "What's a copper snake?" Thankfully, Kate looked as confused as me. "Oh, you must remember, Kate." Claire Winters, who was sitting to the right of Natasha, gave her a withering look. "We did one for the last autumn fundraiser, and we had the second spot in the county. It's where all the kids bring in as many copper coins as they can find, and we curl them round to look like a snake. Then we measure it to see how long it is. Trust the bloody Oak Tree lot to want to go one better." "Does it matter as long as we're both raising funds for the schools?" I might as well have admitted I deliberately ran over people's pets for kicks, given the expressions on the faces of the women sitting opposite me. "Of course it matters. Just because Oak Tree Forestall is a bit bigger than us, they think they're better too. And as for the chair of their PTA..." Natasha shook her head, her hair flicking from side to side so that Claire had to duck out of the way. This was more than just a bit of friendly competition, and I caught Cameron and Ruhan exchanging a look. "Let's not get personal." Dolly's tone was calm, but Natasha pursed her lips. "Worrying about what they're doing isn't going to help us achieve our best, is it? I'd rather spend the time thrashing out our own ideas." "We could do fill the bag again. I've got loads of old clothes I could collect for it." Kate's suggestion was met with more sniggers from Natasha's friends, but if it bothered her, she didn't let it show. That's a great idea. Dolly scribbled a note on the end of the agenda in front of her. But seeing as we had one just before the end of last term, it might be better to wait until nearer to Christmas when everybody's ready for another wardrobe clear-out. How about giving out tubes of Smarties again and getting the kids to fill the empty tubes with silver coins to bring back in? Didn't we do quite well out of that last time? Ruhan's hopeful expression didn't last. Been there and done that. And anyway, not everyone wants their children to be loaded up with sugar and E-numbers. Claire Winters was really starting to get on my nerves. Actually, there aren't any E-numbers in Smarties. We checked before we sent them out. Even Dolly was starting to lose her cool. But we did have some complaints that we were contributing to childhood obesity. Please tell me you're joking. I've been out of full-time teaching for almost 5 years, but surely things hadn't got this bad. You'd be amazed at the things we get complaints about, Scarlett. Cameron raised his eyebrows, and for the first time I noticed what an unusual colour his eyes were. Grey with flecks of amber and, at that particular moment, more than a hint of amusement. How about an exhibition of the children's art? I did one at the last school I worked in, and you raise money by charging an entry fee to the children's families, and for a programme with photographs of all the artwork in. You can also do prints for people to buy, or other things like calendars and tea towels. I waited for the disparaging comments from the other side of the table, but Natasha and the others were actually nodding. Great idea. Ode is always drawing in her spare time. Every time Natasha said her daughter's name, I had to suppress the urge to smile. Then I remembered the poor kid was stuck with that for life. Brilliant, so we've got our idea. Dolly was smiling again. Is there anything in particular the money is being raised for this time? Mrs. Davy asked me to mention the possibility of buying some more picture books for the infant school with a focus on diversity of family type. Cameron looked directly at Dolly as he spoke, but there were still mutterings from across the table. I'm not being funny, Claire Winters said, and I doubted she was capable of being funny if she tried. But I think we already spend far too much on this sort of stuff. We funded the Food from Around the World Day last term, and most of the children at Applebury come from normal families anyway, so why can't we do something for all the kids? And how exactly would you define normal, Claire? Kate was visibly bristling, and I had a horrible feeling that at least part of her outrage was for my benefit. Oh, you know what I mean. Claire threw up her arms. Stop being so bloody precious about it. Just because you want to suck up to Scarlett. I'm sure she hasn't got a massive chip on her shoulder about being a single mum. It's not like she did it by choice. That's enough. Dolly actually slapped her paperwork on the table and looked pointedly at Claire. This is not about anyone's personal circumstances. It's for the benefit of all the children, to help make them accepting of everyone. It's okay, Dolly. I think it's best if I get things out in the open, then people can find something else to talk about. I cleared my throat, wondering if the words would actually come out. But honesty was supposed to be the best policy, and if it gave Natasha and her friends something to laugh about in the bar later, then at least some good had come out of my crappy situation. Some of you know that I went to school in Applebury myself, and even back then, I always wanted to be a teacher. I stayed on in Exeter after my degree when I got my first teaching job down there, but I ended up meeting my husband when I came back here for the holidays one summer. Some of you knew Luke too. Natasha was even at our wedding, but we decided to move back to the West Country after we got married and open a bed and breakfast and run it together, so we could fit the hours around Ava and have time together as a family. But I'm sure you already know that Luke walked out at the end of the summer last year and just never came back. I won't bore you with the details of how I ended up back here, but it hasn't been easy. I know most people at the school don't look like they've been through anything like that, but I'm sure there are children whose families have far more to contend with than we know about. So if buying a few books makes a difference to those children, then I'm all for it. By the time I finished speaking, I was breathless and couldn't look at anyone. If I'd seen any hint of a smirk from across the other side of the table, I wouldn't have been responsible for my actions. But at least they knew everything now. Nobody said anything for what felt like forever, until Dolly reached across Kate and put her hand over mine. "Thank you, Scarlett. You didn't have to tell everyone that. But I think it goes to show how important these sorts of resources are for all the children, regardless of what we think we know about them and their home lives." Dolly moved the agenda on, and everyone agreed to the purchase of the books. Even Claire Winters seemed to go quiet. Did I just make a complete idiot of myself? I turned to the others after the meeting had come to a close and Natasha and her friends had disappeared downstairs to the bar. "Well, I thought you were brilliant." Kate clapped her hand on my shoulder. "That Claire Winters could do with putting in her place more often." I don't want to cause a rift in the PTA, though. It sounds as though there are enough issues with Oak Tree Forestall. That's all on Natasha. I don't know why she hates that PTA chair so much, but whatever it is definitely personal. Dolly shrugged. "But you did the right thing. There's nothing for them to speculate about now. They know it all." "Let's forget about them. They're probably downstairs now rating all of our outfits out of 10, and I've almost certainly got minus points. Are we still doing supper club this month?" Kate dropped me a wink. "I did tell you about supper club, Scarlett, didn't I? There's been so much going on since the start of term that I can't remember if I said it or just thought about saying it." Ruhan was packing up her bag, but she stopped to look at me. "I don't think so. We meet on the third Saturday of every month, just me, Kate, and Dolly, and we go to a restaurant. It's a way of making sure that we still get the occasional night out without the kids in tow. We keep asking Cam, but for some reason he never seems keen to hang around with a bunch of women outside of work." She laughed as Cameron shook his head. "It's no use, Cam. We've heard every excuse there is from you now, so we'll just have to work on Scarlett instead." "I'd love to." They were the sort of women I could definitely imagine being friends with, and they knew my most embarrassing secret already. "That's brilliant. We're definitely on then." Ruhan grinned. "So go on then, Cam. What is your excuse going to be this month?" "All right, you've worn me down. I'll give it a go this month. As long as you promise to steer clear of certain topics, and I don't just mean work." "Text me a list," Ruhan laughed. "Miracles never cease. I didn't think you'd ever cave in and join us." "I think I can guess why." Kate muttered the words and then dropped another perfect wink. My mother wasn't the only one with the subtlety of a brick, and with Ruhan that was 3 of them on my case. Sadly, they were all in for a big disappointment. Chapter 3.